I've made one wise decision today, and that was to flip the order, because not only was Rachel's presentation a fantastic one, it actually is very complimentary to what I'm going to say. She said she wasn't going to talk about education, but I thought she talked a lot about it to my ears, particularly in the Pinster trial. Now, there are three names on my title slide. Many of you will know of, if you don't personally know, Mary Tully, who is the woman who put the cool into pharmacy, as far as I'm concerned, a fantastic collaborator. Lucy McClellan is a medical student in Manchester who is doing an intercalated PhD under my supervision, looking at how senior medical students learn prescribing. And I am a really unusual, odd sort of character. And I'm going to just sort of say a little bit about myself and my perspective by reference to this. This is the sort of template that Maastricht University provides me with for my presentations. And the first thing I point out is that the strapline of this research-intensive university is leading in learning. And it's quite nice to see a research-intensive university that actually values learning. And in fact, that's very much the interest both in research as well as in education in Maastricht University. Now, this bridge here is the Hogebrug, which was built in the millennium. And that's the River Maas, and you can just see the spires of one of the two basilicas in Maastricht in the background. And the significant thing is that although this is in the Netherlands, it's a predominantly Catholic population. So it's in the southernmost part of the Netherlands. I left my flat there at 5 o'clock this morning, and it looked very much like this when I left. And it has this large river going through it, which is the River Maas, which eventually ends up in the delta, which is where the Rhine runs into the sea, in Rotterdam sort of area. Now, if you go across Hogebrug, in this direction, you come to something called 1992-plein, which is actually 1992 square as the literal translation. And that is the only nod in the city of Maastricht to what you all know it by, which is the Maastricht Treaty. And in fact, it's actually a beautiful city, which is a Roman foundation. And I am in the very fortunate position that if you go across Hogebrug through 1992-plein and then onto Sphinxlunet, and my flat is there. So anyway, that's Maastricht. But I'm actually a doctor. I was a consultant in Steve's Hospital until about 3 years ago. But I had a position as a consultant in the University of Manchester and got interested in education. So I started a master's in the year 2000. Maastricht is, dare I say it, the international centre of excellence in medical education, and certainly bibliometrically it's got number 1 and number 2 in the world of people for research output in our field. So I did a master's there and was really inspired, and then went on and did a PhD. And we do our PhDs by publication in the Netherlands. So it means that I've got something like 15 supervisees, all of whom will be producing published output because they can't get a PhD without it. So it actually draws research and graduate education together into one harmonious activity, because I work closely with my supervisees and we co-publish. So that's sort of where Lucy fits in. Right, my talk, I'd nearly forgot about that. No, just a word more, and that is that I got really interested. I got more and more disaffected with the medical model, and got very interested first in qualitative research and then in learning theory. And so I'm in the extraordinary position that I work in this powerhouse of research into learning, and I, the doctor, am the person who's probably giving a lot of insight about social sciences to my psychologist professorial colleagues, who actually have quite narrow perspectives on learning. So it's been an interesting journey for me. Now, this blurry thing here is an artifact piece of paper, and it's got some hieroglyphs on it, and it's called a prescription chart. But my point is that when we talk about learning to prescribe, it's very easy to get transfixed by this artifact with the hieroglyphs on it. And of course, I've taken that from a picture which will warm the cockles of Steve's heart, because that's L7 at Hope Hospital with Bob Young on the right-hand side. And this is actually the context in which prescriptions are written. So you can see 4 doctors. The most senior one is on the right, the most junior one is second from the left. You can just about make out the patient who's all but forgotten in the background, discussing the artifact of the prescription chart and the hieroglyphs, and then something's going to happen. But what I'd like to illustrate by this is that prescribing is an exceptionally complex social phenomenon, and that's what I thought Rachel illustrated so beautifully in connection with community prescribing. Now, my moment in the sun was actually about 5 days after I retired from the National Health Service. Probably not a bad thing. This is a heading from in the Guardian about junior doctors make errors in 8% of prescriptions, spun absolutely brilliantly by the GMC in such a way as to make the remedy for this problem everybody's responsibility but the GMC's. It's good to see people who are really slick at using the press at work. But what I want you to think about for a moment is that one of my colleagues, Jeroen van Merienboer, is really one of the world's leaders in instructional design for complex safety-critical situations. He's actually only entered the world of health recently, and he would be more at home in the control tower in Schiphol Airport than on a hospital ward, because that's where he's done all his work. So let's use an aviation simile. And so just imagine if 8% of approaches to Heathrow Airport, the pilot had taken a flawed approach, and that actually in 1 in 250 landings would have resulted in planes crashing were it not for the corrective action of air traffic control. So assuming that many of the audience are pharmacists, you are the air traffic controllers who are stopping pilots crashing planes every day. And it seems to me that you might ask the question, have we got the right approach to training pilots? I think that perhaps I must be a rather introspective sort of person, because I tend to try and analyse the problem, but other people like to jump into treatment without analysing the problem. So here we have Jeff Aronson's wonderful leader in the BMJ, a prescription for better prescribing. And certainly the clinical pharmacology lobby were in no doubt about the solution, and the prescription to improve prescribing would be that education should be taken as much as possible, or often as possible, repeat prescription, lifelong learning. Special study modules for graduate and undergraduate should be taken as required. Proper assessment in the final undergraduate exam to be taken once or twice so it's regulated, national prescribing form. Now, the thing that fascinates me, because I've got quite interested in discourse, which is actually what social phenomena are represented by the written word, is that this represents what has now come to be called as the acquisition metaphor of learning, where learning is something you acquire, you take it like a pill. And if you reflect for a moment on Rachel's sessions when the pharmacists went out to the GPs in the Pincer trial, the pill was a very small part of the intervention, because it was actually a behaviourally orientated complex social intervention, which probably addressed things like power and hierarchy as well as communication of information. And just as a point of interest, there is a big literature about continuing medical education and its ability to change practice, and the evidence is that CME is almost universally ineffective, and that really the only CME interventions that have been shown to improve health outcomes are ones of precisely the sort that she described, which are called in the US literature academic detailing, which were classically done by pharmacists going out and detailing doctors about their prescribing behaviours based on evidence. So actually the Pincer trial is a cool example of an evidence-based complex educational intervention which is embedded in practice. So you were talking about education much more than you realised. So anyway, rather than rushing into prescribing the pill for better prescribing, it seems to me that it's worth just reflecting a little bit about actually, well, hey, hang on a minute, what's the disease? What is it that causes prescribing errors? And I was fascinated to hear the similarity between what Rachel described in community prescribing and, to me, what are the salient points about hospital prescribing. And we should probably use a sort of clapometer to get the audience to determine whether hospitals of general practice are more complicated. But just this is a complexogram, which just shows that when a foundation trainee makes a prescribing error, these are the sort of number of factors, like busy, tired, couldn't access BNF. But the other thing that is really interesting is that I showed you the ward round at the beginning and present it to you as a social phenomenon. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is learning as a socially embedded phenomenon. And if you look at prescribing errors, you have to explain the phenomenon that we observed in the EQUIP study, where a foundation trainee wrote the right drug for a patient, but felt insecure, called the registrar advised the wrong drug, and the trainee changed the prescription. So this is where we really have to acknowledge the full complexity. Now, from my perspective, that's quite easy to understand, because actually the thing that's really important is not the ability to put hieroglyphs on a piece of paper, but actually the construction of the identity of a doctor and a safe prescriber. And actually, for that foundation trainee's identity, it was more important to conform to what the team said should be done and the senior person than to actually hang on to the pill that was given during undergraduate education. So learning is embedded in practice, and it's a social phenomenon which has to take account of hierarchy and identity and other considerations of that sort. I'm not really trying to win you over to my sort of type of research, but it's cool stuff to look at. So this is a simplification of the complex system. Now, the question then is, how could you educate safer prescribers? And Lucy has conducted, she's an extremely smart medical student, typical female medical students being very smart and very modest. And the first paper she's done for her PhD is an evidence review. In medical education, we have a slightly different idea about evidence from the classical Cochrane type approach, and they're often theory-guided literature reviews. So what we did was to look at all of the theory about learning complex skills to try and build a theoretical model of how you learn to prescribe. I have the model on the slide, but I thought it might put you into free fall if I showed it to you, because it includes things like metacognition and unfamiliar concepts. But we, broadly speaking, looked at everything we know about learning skills for safety-critical situations. And then we mapped the literature to that model so that we could see not just what the evidence showed, but what problems people were trying to address in their interventions. Now, the model, these are the salient elements of the model, that actually, to start with, we have to think about different types of knowledge. And so the type of knowledge that I think Rachel described her general practitioners developing is what is talked about as pragmatic knowledge, which is very different from textbook declarative knowledge. And one of the leading scholars in professional learning in Britain is a man called Michael Eraut, who some of you may have heard of, who's produced a whole typology of the type of knowledge that practitioners use. Again, not drawn from medicine, it's drawn from nursing, law, accountancy. And actually, the type of knowledge that tends to be emphasized in undergraduate curricula is only a tiny part of the actual whole breadth of types of knowledge that people actually use. And you all know that. I'm sure you can, as long as I'm not using too much jargon, I'm sure if you just think about how you work and the type of knowledge you use, it will be a complex, practical, contextually embedded type of knowledge. And that actually the problem about theoretical, factual knowledge is that there is a massive task to transfer that from the school, the classroom, the book, to the field of practice. So there's types of knowledge, but actually attitudes like the foundation trainee who changed the right prescription to the wrong one we're really working in the values domain there, because there was some value about conformity that was more important than the declarative knowledge about what the right drug was. Skills, that's actually quite a complex concept in such a knowledge-rich thing as prescribing. If we think of skills, typically you think of something you do with your hands. What's the skill of prescribing? Interesting. Then, if you look at, for example, driving a car as the classic example, to start with, when you change gear, it's an effortful, thoughtful, cognitive process, but you will automate that process. But if you drive without thinking, you'll kill somebody. So there is part of driving, even in the most expert driver, which requires conscious thought. And so actually within driving, some of our task skills are automatic. Some of them are ones that demand at least monitoring. And then if a pedestrian steps out in the road in the front of you, flip from automatic to conscious processing. Then there is the whole business about performance in context. And probably the catchphrase for my presentation would be context. Because if we talk about prescribing without the context, the pharmacist detailing the general practitioners in the context where the table and the whiteboards and so on are the artifacts of the context of practice, that will be much more effective than something in a classroom. Then there is the whole business about knowing when you need help. And one of the projects we're beginning to do now is to try and see if we can work out what constitutes in a general practitioner knowing when you get outside your comfort zone. So we don't actually know what the signals are that set off the process that gets you thinking consciously. We have a theoretical perspective on how to look at that, and it's probably about becoming aware of feelings of discomfort and then switching into automatic processing. But there is an angle within learning psychology that we think could help us interpret that. And then there is the business of you learn in one context, you've got to learn in a new one. So very simply, you learn to prescribe in hospital A, doesn't matter how experienced you are, you go to hospital B or general practice, or you move between practices. There is a big learning task. It's usually called transfer, but Erout points out that actually transferring learning from one context to another isn't just taking it with you, it's relearning in a new context. Now, this is the result of our literature review. So actually the solutions are in blue, which is that the literature about how medical students, how the interventions that have been done to help medical students learn to prescribe are mostly about knowledge, but they also go a bit into skills like how to put hieroglyph on a piece of paper. But that actually the problem is about performance in context. Now, it's not all doom and gloom, because the General Medical Council, which I think is far-sighted and it does listen very carefully, is actually reinstating contextual learning in undergraduate medical programs by reinstating shadowing periods towards the end of program. They used to be called locums in my day, but now it's shadowing because doctors are by law incompetent until the moment they have to become competent, but you can at least get them very embedded into context so it's not unfamiliar when they have to work in it for real. So look at how little of the complexity of my diagram and Rachel's is actually being addressed in basic education. So I'm near the end of my presentation. So the important elements of learning to prescribe, and again, for those who are pharmacists or indeed working in other fields, just reflect for a moment about what this means in terms of your own discipline and how you might train people to be able to do the stuff you're able to do. If this is, by the way, the same as the slide I showed before, but I've just compressed the left-hand side down, so it's got the same sort of items in it. So if you think about integrated knowledge, skills and attitudes, this thing called problem-based learning, which is small group learning, which at least has an element of context, sets out to integrate knowledge, attitudes and skills. If you think about automatic performance, that's where simulation education comes in. So that, for example, the surgeon who's doing laparoscopic surgery doesn't have to consciously deal with the bleeder when they're still consciously having to deal with manipulating the laparoscope. They can learn how to manipulate the laparoscope in simulation, and that then means they're better prepared to do the learning that still has to be done in context. Then performance in context is something that seems to me to be acquired in more junior placement learning. Knowing when you need help and transferring to a new context are the things which have to be learned through advanced experience, but actually experience. Michael O'Donnell, the famous medical humorist, defined experience as doing the same thing wrong with increasing confidence over an impressive number of years. So actually, experience is not learning unless it is looked at critically, and that's actually quite hard to do on your own. So that, again, the social dimension, sorry to keep picking on the pincer trial, but it really exemplified some beautiful points about what I think is very good educational practice. So that the group dynamic of reflection, the sharing of good practice, which Rachel referred to, seems to me a very good example of an authentic type of learning. Now, actually, again, the business about lifelong learning was touched upon, and the poor relation in medical education is CME. It's fascinating. In the Netherlands, nobody's even heard of it there, which really interests me, unimaginable in the UK context. But if I talk about CME, certainly to the educationalists, they say, what's that? And it's not because their language skills are poor, but that actually advanced experience is a lifelong process. So one of the questions is how can we maintain that reflective process that prevents us from automating faulty behaviours. So this is my final slide. So I think that the important thing to think of is prescribing not as a hieroglyph on a piece of paper, but as an end-to-end system, which for me the social dimension of that is very important, but there's different ways of looking at systems. And actually, the people who are most brilliant at looking systems are software developers. So actually one of the interesting things about developing technical solutions is that people who want to make money out of software work very, very hard to understand the social context in which the software is going to operate. So I think the whole business about developing technology and making it fit for social situations is a very, very valid exercise. Now, I'm not so interested in enhancing and quality assuring task performance because, if you like, that's practice. I'm interested in learning to practice, though actually the two are inextricably related. But it seems to me that what technology can do, my technology colleagues, e-learning, my technology colleagues talk about the affordances of technology. Learning is the same as it always was, but if you bring technology along, it allows things to happen that you couldn't otherwise do. So I just had a conversation in break time about the way being able to give people real-time feedback on their performance, for example, or the drugs they use and stuff like that. That's an affordance of technology. It would be unimaginable without it. So I think that if you think about what technology can do in the complex setting of medical education, I think that one of the problems about small group learning is that it's decontextualized. Think, for example, about a PBL group that had a computer workstation with the real-time, with the prescribing assistants used in the hospital in terms of actually bringing authenticity and reality into a place that's away from the bedside. So that seems interesting to me. I think the thing that is fascinating is that I'm very skeptical about simulation. I remember once nearly having to be carried out of a lecture which came from a centre in Britain which is very big on simulation, where they'd put millions of pounds into simulating hospital at night. Can you imagine anything as stupid as that? Really? What is hospital at night? It's an unsafe, dark place. Why the hell would you want to simulate that? Every hospital in the land is dark and unsafe at night. Put your learners in there. Don't waste millions of pounds on simulating it. But actually, ePMA is a fantastic instance of where the authentic technology is practice. It's one of the central artifacts and systems of authentic practice. So actually, it's the easiest thing of the world to take that into your simulation laboratory, but that's valid, unlike the simulated hospital at night, which isn't dangerous enough. Okay? The other thing is that we did a project which was very, very simple, which was how do registrars learn? And you might think that, or what we call now specialist trainees, specialist registrars, you might think that since every registrar in the world, of whom there are hundreds of thousands, learns in practice settings, you might think there's a rich literature about that. We could find 3 papers published in the last 10 years on how registrars learn, and we thought that only 2 of those were really particularly strong. So actually some of the stuff we most often do is the least researched. But we have done a study looking in Manchester, shadowing and doing interviews and so on with rheumatology registrars to find out how they really learn to become rheumatologists. And the authentic learning has to be embedded in context. But IT systems provide a very, very interesting possibility to provide portfolios, for example, which are utterly embedded in practice, where you don't decontextualize and take off to the portfolio that nobody actually really is very interested in, but you could have a portfolio which is within the heart of practice. It's on the wrong side of the firewall for comfort, but we've got to decide whether we really want safe doctors or not. And so I would call that scaffolding. So technology can provide a scaffolding for authentic learning in practice. And then finally, just again, as we heard illustrated in the previous talk, about actually refining knowledge and skills lifelong, because technology in prescribing lies at the heart of that. So I've gone on probably longer than I should have done, Gary, but thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for your attention.